Ladies and gentlemen, good evening and welcome. I am thrilled tonight to welcome back to How To Academy two genuine superstars of the intellectual world. Professor Steven Pinker is the author of The Language Instinct, The Blank Slate, many other books, and, of course, the subject of tonight's discussion, rationality. He's in conversation with Oxford's Professor Marcus du Sautoy. Please give them a huge welcome.
And I guess in this age of kind of fake news, quack kind of remedies for things, the idea of producing a book on trying to get people to think a bit straighter, I mean, there seems to be a surge of irrational thinking. Was that the kind of motivation for you writing this book, just seeing that we seem to be losing our minds out there?
It wasn't the motive. It originated as a course, and like I think probably many mathematicians, certainly many social scientists, I had a feeling that some of the tools that we use in our line of work ought to be given away, exported, that anyone can profit from better intuitions about probability and logic and Bayesian reasoning, namely calibrating your degree of credence in a hypothesis to the strength of the evidence, game theory. These are just mental tools that everyone should command. I didn't know of any course that package them all in one curriculum. There are a lot of courses on statistics and probability, but they tend not to have logic in the same curriculum or game theory. And, but of course, as soon as I mention to people I'm going to be teaching a course on rationality, the inevitable question is, why does humanity seem to be losing its mind? So it was adventitiously timely, topical, and I, of course, couldn't avoid that topic, and it does make up one of the chapters of the book called What's Wrong with People.
Exactly, yeah. I guess sitting here as a mathematician, you're slightly preaching to the converted as far as I'm concerned, because, you know, I kind of, rationality is really the way that I think, and I particularly liked, there was a quote you used of Leibniz, which I think is my kind of philosophy of life, that the only way to rectify our reasonings is to make them as tangible as those of the mathematicians, so that we can find our error at a glance. And when there are disputes among persons, we can simply say, let us calculate without further ado and see who is right. So why am I doomed to failure in trying to reduce everybody to calculations?
Yes, so Leibniz's logical utopia in which any disagreement could be settled by deduction is not with us for a number of reasons. One of them is that a lot of our knowledge doesn't consist of propositions that are true or false and implications that necessarily follow from them, which is the stuff of classical logic, but consists of large numbers of probabilistic cues that we kind of add up and weight, put into context. In logic, people often ask me, what's the difference between logic and reason, or logic and rationality? Logic is just one of the tools of rationality. And to do logic, you have to do something that can often be quite irrational, namely forget everything you know and concentrate only on what's stated in the premises. You forget the entirety of your world knowledge. That's what makes logic and indeed academic thinking so foreign to people who haven't been immersed in schooling, non-Western peoples, children, where it never makes sense to forget everything you know in real life, but that's exactly what you have to do in logic. So if the syllogism that you're asked to validate is all plant products are healthy, tobacco is a plant product, therefore tobacco is healthy. Now that is a valid syllogism, but people get it wrong because they can't get out of their head, tobacco healthy? What are you kidding? Now, of course, that is highly relevant to anything you'd have to do in the world, but in terms of the task stated as a logic problem, it gets you the wrong answer. And so logic is obviously an indispensable tool. Computers are basically logic and silicon. And there are cases in which you really do want to forget everything you know and concentrate only on what's stipulated in the premises. In legal reasoning, for example, you may want to deliberately blind yourself to prejudicial factors like, say, the race of the defendant. In biology, sometimes you want to forget about superficial similarities so that you can call a porpoise a mammal instead of a fish, where it's closer to a deductive system. So in formal science And in other and formal law, you do want the gift of forgetting the entirety of your knowledge and concentrating only on the premises. But generally in everyday life, that would be a foolish thing to do.
I think the other point that you make in the book, which is, I think, relevant to this, was that, you know, as a mathematician, when I'm trying to prove a theorem, I have to define things very explicitly, and so that definition will absolutely pin down the object that I'm trying to prove something about. But actually, trying to pin down the definition of things that we use in everyday language is often a real problem. I mean, you talk about Wittgenstein's attempt to try and define what a game is. So you're trying to prove something, you know, reduce it to a mathematical logical proof, but actually you can't pin down in language what a game is. I mean, is that one of our problems that sort of...
And that's another reason why logic in the formal sense is often kind of useless for everyday reasoning. So game is an example, and vegetable. Now, of course, there are domains of thinking in which we do have to stipulate rules and ascertain whether a fuzzy category fits the definition. For example, did Bill Clinton and Monica Lewinsky have sex? I mean, now, sex is a fuzzy family resemblance category. On the other hand, the law has to deal with stipulated formal logical rules just so that the guilt and innocence aren't up to the whim of a judge. And a lot of legalistic reasoning consists of trying to shoehorn our fuzzy probabilistic concepts into these classical categories that have necessary and sufficient conditions.
I guess you talked about Kahneman quite a lot in the book, and his ideas of the fact that we have these two systems of thinking seem to be the sort of difficulty that some people are having with applying rationality, that our first kind of reaction, our intuitive idea about how to solve a problem is often not the right one. We need to slow down, you know, thinking fast and slow. The slow version is applying our kind of analytic mind. So is this kind of a sort of battle between these two sorts of thinking that we have in our brain, that are what we use this system one, the fast intuitive, which often just is wrong, and we have to slow down to do this kind of rational sort of thinking?
Indeed, and we can be fooled by certain intuitions that don't apply to a particular case. I mean, another example from that style of question is if there are lily pads on a pond that double every day, and after 30 days the pond is completely covered, on what day will it be half covered? People say, well, you know, first inclination is 15, and maybe they adjust upward a little bit, 16 or 17. The answer, of course, is day 29, because if it doubles every day and it's full on the 30th day, then it was half covered on the 29th day. It's an example of how exponential growth is surprisingly unintuitive, and it does, even though that might sound like a trick question, a gotcha, there are many cases in everyday life in which a failure to appreciate exponential growth has real consequences, such as people don't save early enough for retirement, even a small amount of money invested early on because of compound interest, which grows exponentially, can give you quite the nest egg by the time you're ready for retirement. Or conversely, people who take out credit card loans where the credit card company charges interest on the interest can quickly wipe out a life savings. Another example, and this is one that afflicts even experts, even the kind of person, I'm not going to name any names, but two different kind of experts on statistical reasoning and its and the fallacies that people made themselves committed the fallacy when early in the days of the COVID pandemic, they said, well, the rate of death from COVID is comparable to strep throat, to the flu, to other things that we tolerate without shutting down society. You're much more likely to be killed in a car crash. It's a familiar trope in experts on human probabilistic fallacies and biases. But in this case, because an infectious disease can expand exponentially as every person you cough on not only gets sick but becomes an infector who coughs on others, who then in turn become infectors. The the death rate shot up exponentially and quickly overtook strep throat and flu and so on. So it's an unintuitive concept that can have real life consequences, but more generally, the mindset of distrusting your first intuition, your gut feeling, and thinking it through to make sure you weren't fooled, is one of the traits that goes into a kind of rationality quotient, which is not the same as the intelligence quotient, although there is some degree of correlation. People who are more resistant to the quick but wrong answer also tend to be more skeptical of claims of the paranormal. They tend to be less susceptible to conspiracy theories. They even are less susceptible to, the technical term is pseudo-intellectual bullshit. Namely, if you string together a lot of highfalutin, fancy schmancy words, so it sounds like it could be some profundity, but it actually makes no sense, and you ask people, is this meaningful? The people who fall for these simple math problems are more likely to attribute meaning to pseudo-intellectual bullshit. They're also more likely, on average, there are a number of correlations that weakly but significantly correlate with each other. Probably less likely to get into accidents, less likely to get into debt, less likely to get into mishaps like locking their keys in the car. So a general habit of avoiding cognitive impulsiveness is a big component of, psychologically, it's a major component of rationality insofar as it can be distinguished just from raw intelligence.
I think the example of exponential growth is very relevant, obviously, to today. Our governments just don't seem to learn what exponential growth is. They wait for it to become very big numbers and don't realize that 1, 2, 4, 8 is also exponential growth. It's just very small numbers. I mean, the kind of the classic example I often use is the person who invented chess gets asked for a reward by the king who enjoys the game and says, put 1 grain of rice on the first square of the chessboard, 2 on the next, 4, and the king thinks he's got away with a very cheap price for the game of chess, but doesn't realize that the first row, the amount of rice might be a piece of sushi, but by the halfway across, you wiped out the whole rice population of India.
For 10,000 years. Yeah.
Exactly.
It's a wonderful example. I didn't use it in rationality because I used it in a previous book. And I didn't want to repeat my examples. But it is a wonderful example.
Well, actually, I'm wearing my vampire Count von Counts tonight as well. And I found this one was quite good with kids, actually, that because it's quite a good proof that there are no vampires. Because if there was a vampire, then it has to feed on a human every month and then changes them into a vampire. And then you've got 2 vampires, and so the next month they've got to feed on 2 other humans. So actually, how long would it take to make the whole population of the planet into vampires? And it's actually only 30 months or something like that. And so that seems to be a good proof of...
That's excellent.
But I use that to try to explain to kids what was happening with this virus, and that one seemed to work quite well.
Well, it's an interesting question as a psychologist and one who thinks often in evolutionary terms, and we have my friend Richard Dawkins is here in the front row. I'm very pleased to see him. But the question that we often ask is, what would be the best adaptive explanation for why we should be blind to exponential growth, given that's what organisms do? I mean, that's what pathogens do. That's what scum on a pond does. And it's a bit of a mystery. The only thing the best I could do is that probably exponential growth in nature just never goes on for very long. There's a law, I think it's called Stein's law, things that can't go on forever don't. And that in any finite environment, because exponential growth really does saturate it very quickly, that any living organism would pretty soon, its growth rate would be checked by waste, by running out of space, by fouling its own environment. So in fact, probably most biological processes as we observe them are S-shaped rather than exponential.
Yes. And I suppose it's, we don't actually have that good an experience of very large numbers. So, very quickly, we're just not aware of if something does go explode, that we know 100 people very well or something like that. And I think, you actually have kind of 7 lessons in the book, sort of trying to teach people each of these kind of different approaches to a rational approach to kind of solving problems. And one of the ones you've talked about already, sort of probability. I mean, we seem to be very, very bad at probability. Our intuition often catches us out, and you have some lovely examples in the book, sort of showing why everyone's intuitive response is wrong when you analyze the kind of mathematics of probability. I mean, why do you think we are so bad at assessing risk and probability?
Yeah, and in fact, I don't put it that way, that we're bad, and that is a natural conclusion to come to, especially from reading the work of Tversky and Kahneman, Amos Tversky, Daniel Kahneman's late collaborator, who showed a number of the ways in which we are systematically tripped up. The gambler's fallacy: people think that if the roulette wheel if the ball lands on red 7 or 8 times in a row, it's more likely to land black the next time, even though every spin of the wheel is independent, and so it's a little less than 50% each time. The infamous conjunction fallacy, immortalized as the Linda problem, this was in the 80s, so we have a baby boomer protagonist. But Linda, because I don't think girls are named Linda anymore, but I grew up with lots of Lindas. So Linda is very smart. She majored in philosophy. She's kind of a social justice warrior. She marches in Black Lives Matter protests. What is the probability that Linda is a bank teller? What is the probability that Linda is a bank teller who's active in the feminist movement? And people tend to give a higher probability to the second, even though that violates the conjunction rule, namely that the probability of A and B must be less than or equal to the probability of A. And the fallacy is like saying that you're more likely to draw a red queen from a deck of cards than a red card. And when you think about it, that just can't be right. So that's another example of a systematic probability illusion. And yet another one is the availability bias, namely that people use availability of anecdotes, episodes, narratives from memory as a way of estimating probability. So notoriously, they feel that plane travel is a hazard, and so drive from one place to another, even though per passenger mile car travel is vastly more dangerous. But because every plane crash gets saturation coverage in the news, but car crashes kind of dribble in a few deaths at a time, it's easy to remember a plane crash, not so easy to remember a dozen car crashes, and so our sense of probability is distorted. So those are all examples that can lead to the conclusion that we are oblivious to probability. We're probability blind, as one psychologist put it. That can't be right. And again, there are many animals who have a keen sense of probability as they forage. And you really, since the world is, Einstein to the contrary notwithstanding, God does play dice, or at least it's on scales that are relevant to our well-being and well-being of all animals. And it would be quite anomalous if we had no sense of probability at all. And I try to resolve that paradox by drawing on the work of other psychologists who know that the way in which the problems are presented to people make a big difference, and people can be less foolish than you might think if you present probability in a more mind-friendly format. In particular, the concept probability itself is actually a word with many senses. There isn't actually one rigorous concept called probability, but the word itself can refer to propensity, namely how likely is a physical object to behave in a particular way owing to its makeup. Frequency in the long run: you flip a coin 1,000 times, how many of them will be heads? Degree of confidence in a single event, namely for this coin flip, on a scale from 0 to 1, what is your subjective confidence that it will land heads? And warrant by the evidence, the kind of probability that's applied in a court of law. Have I given you good reasons to believe in it? Or how good are the reasons that I've given you to believe in an outcome? And people, like philosophers of probability, distinguish them. And when problems are presented in the asking for the probability of a single event, which when you think about it is something of an enigmatic concept. Like, what does it mean to say that, to ask what the probability is that Linda is a bank teller? You know, either she is a bank teller or she isn't a bank teller. You might think, well, it's not a question about probability. That's a sense, the only meaning of probability that is sensible in the context of a single event has to be subjective degree of confidence. Because you don't have 1,000 Lindas, so you can count up how many of them are bank tellers or feminist bank tellers. People's sense of probability might correspond more to frequency in the long run, which is really the way in which we encounter probability-relevant information in our lives in a natural environment. Namely, of all the times that you eat a particular food, how often do you get sick? Of all the times in which you look for rabbit along this route, how many of them do you actually find rabbits? And indeed, when you present some of these problems to people not couched as probability of a single event, you know, again, there are even some, I understand some statisticians who claim that it's an incoherent concept, then people do better. They don't, not all of them get the right answer, but if you say, instead of saying, here's Linda, you say, imagine 100 women like Linda. How many of them are bank tellers? How many of them are feminist bank tellers? And there, very few commit the conjunction fallacy. Interestingly, some still do.
Yes.
But far fewer.